From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
In the Cold War, we had an ideological screening test. The time is overdue to develop a new screening test for the threats we face today. I call it extreme vetting.
Extreme vetting. As Donald Trump vows to expand the war against the Islamic State, he calls for immigration to be suspended from parts of the world and for new ideological tests for all immigrants. We'll get response from three guests, Linda Sarsour, Phyllis Bennis, and Rolling Stone's Matt Taibbi. Then we go to Rio de Janeiro to look at race and the Olympic Games, as well as the first refugee Olympic team.
They did march in the opening ceremonies together as a team from different nations under the banner of refugees. And I kind of like it because it flips what is pejorative. And in the United States, we're saying that we should keep refugees out. The IOC is allowing them to Olympics, so let's pay some attention to that.
We'll speak with sports writer Jesse Washington and U.S. gold medalist swimmer Anthony Irvin. He recently became the oldest ever individual Olympic swimming gold medalist. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump invoked the Cold War as he pledged to wage war against what he described as the ideology of radical Islam. While speaking in Youngstown, Ohio Monday, during his speech, Trump also vowed to impose a system of extreme vetting, a new ideological test for all immigrants. During the speech, Trump also said he'd create a commission on radical Islam, keep Guantanamo Bay open, and stop trying people accused of terrorism in civilian courts. He also reversed an earlier threat that the United States might not meet its NATO obligations and said Monday he would work with NATO allies to defeat Islamic State militants if he wins the White House. Former New York City Mayor Rudolph Giuliani introduced Trump on stage in Youngstown Monday, where Giuliani sparked outrage when he appeared to forget about the events of 9/11.
By the way, under those 8 years, before Obama came along, we didn't have any successful radical Islamic terrorist attack in the United States. They all started when Clinton and Obama got into office.
Giuliani, who is mayor of New York City during the 9/11 attacks. In response, the cover of the New York Daily News today printed Giuliani's words superimposed upon an image of the falling Twin Towers. Meanwhile, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and Vice President Joe Biden held a rally in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Scranton is Biden's hometown. It was Biden's first campaign appearance on behalf of Hillary Clinton. During his speech, Biden said Trump was making the United States less safe.
Ladies and gentlemen, does he have any idea the adverse consequences these outlandish comments have on our allies, our friends, and the physical safety of our troops? Trump is already making our country less safe.
We'll have more on Donald Trump's speech after headlines with Matt Taibbi, Phyllis Bennis, and Linda Sarsour, as well as the words of Hillary Clinton. Milwaukee has imposed a 10 p.m. citywide curfew for teenagers following this weekend's uprising sparked by the fatal police shooting of a 23-year-old African-American man named Sylville Smith. On Sunday, Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker activated the National Guard after local residents set fire to police cars and several businesses, including a gas station, Saturday night. Police say Smith was shot by an officer following a traffic stop. Police Chief Edward Flynn says Smith had turned toward the officer with a gun in his hand. An autopsy conducted Monday shows Smith was fatally shot in his chest and arm. Milwaukee is considered to be one of the most segregated cities in the country. The death toll is rising from the unprecedented flooding in southern Louisiana. At least 7 people have died. More than 10,000 have been forced to relocate to shelters as evacuations and emergency rescues continue. President Obama has declared Louisiana a federal disaster zone. The historic flooding has also caused chaos, especially in the hard-hit areas in and around Baton Rouge. On Monday, one firefighter mistakenly shot another firefighter during a rescue mission near Baton Rouge. The man survived the shooting. The National Weather Service says flooding is expected to continue. More rain is in the forecast for the region this week. The Pentagon's announced it's released 15 prisoners from Guantanamo, marking the largest single transfer since President Obama took office. The 15 men were sent to the United Arab Emirates. Each had been imprisoned by the United States for about 14 years without trial. There are now 61 prisoners remaining at Guantanamo. Of them, 20 have been cleared for release. Some have been cleared for more than a decade. President Obama promised to close the prison at the beginning of his first term in office nearly 8 years ago. In Yemen, as many as 15 people were killed Monday after a U.S.-backed Saudi-led airstrike destroyed a hospital supported by Doctors Without Borders. At least another 19 people were wounded, including 3 foreign doctors, when the airstrike hit Abs Hospital in Yemen's northern Hajj province. Among the victims were 3 Yemeni Doctors Without Borders staff members. Monday's attack on the hospital marks at least the 4th time U.S.-backed Saudi-led airstrikes have hit a Doctors Without Borders-supported hospital in Yemen during the 17-month conflict. This is a local resident reacting to the airstrike.
What did they find at the hospital, other than the sick and the wounded and the injured? There's nothing here except patients and medical staff, Doctors Without Borders and Yemeni doctors.
In Kashmir, at least 5 protesters have been killed after Indian security forces opened fire with automatic rifles on demonstrators Monday, which was Independence Day in India. Among the victims was a 16-year-old boy. Demonstrators were throwing rocks and defying a curfew. Protests have been growing in Kashmir since early July, when Indian security forces killed a Kashmiri independence leader. At least 64 people have been killed and thousands injured during the month-long protests. Turkish state media says at least 3 civilians and 4 police officers have been killed in a car bomb attack on a police station in Turkey's southeast. Authorities say at least 20 more were wounded. No group has claimed responsibility. Local authorities have blamed the attack on the Kurdistan Workers' Party, known as the PKK. In Nigeria, members of the group Bring Back Our Girls protested in the capital Monday, demanding the government do more to rescue the more than 200 Chibok schoolgirls kidnapped by Boko Haram in April of 2014. The protests came one day after Boko Haram released a video that appears to show about 50 of the kidnapped girls. In the video, militants demanded the release of imprisoned fighters in exchange for the girls' release. The video also appears to show the bodies of several girls who militants say were killed by Nigerian airstrikes. In New York City, health officials say the number of people who've been diagnosed with 9/11-linked cancers has tripled. Nearly 5,500 first responders and local residents have now been diagnosed with cancers linked to the toxic smoke and dust of 9/11. That's up from fewer than 2,000 cancer victims in 2014. Health officials have called the increase alarming. Also in New York, hundreds gathered Monday for the funeral of Imam Malama Akanji and his assistant, Thara Udin, who were shot in the back of their heads while walking home from prayer in broad daylight on Saturday. On Monday, suspected shooter Oscar Morel was charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder. Authorities say it's not yet clear whether the imam and his assistant were targeted as a result of their faith. Many in the Queens community of Ozone Park say they think the Islamophobic rhetoric promoted by Donald Trump may have contributed to their deaths. New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio appeared to reference Trump's rhetoric at Monday's funeral.
And we know there are voices all over this country who are spewing hate, trying to create division, trying to turn one American against another. I look around at all my brothers and sisters here. I see proud Americans. I see proud New Yorkers. And I will never let us be torn apart, and we will not let each other be torn apart.
In North Carolina, officials are petitioning the U.S. Supreme Court to reinstate parts of North Carolina's strict voter ID laws, which were blocked last month after a court ruled the measures discriminated against African Americans and targeted them, quote, with almost surgical precision, unquote. Last month's ruling means up to 5% of the state's registered voters targeted by the law can now vote in the general election. But state officials are asking the Supreme Court to reverse this decision, which would once again make it harder for people to vote in November. And here in Manhattan, activists with the group Gays Against Guns rallied outside the New York City headquarters of the investment management company BlackRock to protest its investment in gun manufacturers. As of 2015, BlackRock was one of the top 3 shareholders of the gun manufacturer Smith & Wesson and Sturm Ruger. BlackRock has also invested heavily in major ammunitions companies. During the protests, 12 activists staged a die-in to represent the people killed in the 2012 Aurora, Colorado movie theater massacre. The shooter, James Holmes, had used a Smith & Wesson manufactured semi-automatic rifle. This is organizer Tim Murphy.
We're protesting BlackRock today because they're the largest asset management company in the country. And every time there's a mass shooting since 2012, they buy more and more stocks in guns because they know that the death business is good business for them. They are literally profiting off the backs of dead people.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. On Monday, Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump invoked the Cold War as he pledged to wage war against what he described as the ideology of radical Islam. During a speech in Youngstown, Ohio, Trump vowed to institute extreme vetting of visa applicants.
In the Cold War, we had an ideological screening test. The time is overdue to develop a new screening test for the threats we face today. I call it extreme vetting. I call it extreme vetting. Our country has enough problems. We don't need more. And these are problems like we've never had before. In addition to screening out all members of the sympathizers of terrorist groups, we must also screen out any who have hostile attitudes toward our country or its principles, or who believe that Sharia law should supplant American law. Those who do not believe in our Constitution or who support bigotry and hatred will not be admitted for immigration into our country. Only those who we expect to flourish in our country and to embrace a tolerant American society should be issued visas. To put these new procedures in place, we will have to temporarily suspend immigration from some of the most dangerous and volatile regions of the world that have a history of exporting terrorism.
Donald Trump also said he'd create a commission on radical Islam, keep Guantanamo open, and stop trying people accused of terrorism in civilian courts. He'd initially called for a temporary ban on all Muslim immigration before shifting to a ban on those from countries with a history of terrorism. While his campaign has declined to offer specifics on which countries would qualify, Trump said Monday that his State Department and Department of Homeland Security would decide which regions would qualify based on whether adequate screenings could take place. For more, we're joined by 3 guests. Matt Taibbi, award-winning journalist with Rolling Stone magazine's been closely covering the Trump campaign. His most recent piece is headlined The Summer of the Shill. Phyllis Bennis is a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. She's written several books, including most recently Understanding ISIS and the New Global War on Terror. And Linda Sarsour is with us. She's director of the first Muslim online organizing platform, Empower Change, and co-founder of the Muslim Democratic Club of New York. We welcome you all to Democracy Now! Linda, let's begin with you. Your response to Donald Trump's proposal for extreme vetting, as he calls it.
I mean, it's a continuation of his ludicrous policy proposals. I'm a person who has been working with refugees, asylees in New York City for 15 years. He has no idea the vetting process that immigrants go through before they come to the United States. And he's taking us back to the 1950s, McCarthy era, this idea of creating a committee on radical Islam. Who's going to set the standards for what that looks like? And when he talks about testing immigrants around only those who will flourish in this country, or those who believe in American values, who's going to set what those American values are? Donald Trump? The fact that Rudy Giuliani was even anywhere near this, the fact that Rudy Giuliani could be the next head of the Department of Homeland Security scares me more than Donald Trump. So I wasn't shocked or surprised, but the fact that we have gotten to this point and that our country is allowing a man of this caliber to be running for the highest office of this land is absolutely outrageous.
Matt Taibbi.
Yeah, I mean, I think the speech was crazy, as a lot of Trump's speeches are. Clearly, he's backed off slightly from the let's ban all Muslims idea that he unleashed last year, and he's just rebranding it as extreme vetting, probably because he realized the idea of banning all Muslims is unconstitutional because it would violate the Establishment Clause of the Constitution. But this idea that he thinks that returning to the McCarthy era and having an ideological test and rooting out un-American activities.
Well, let's talk about that, an ideological test.
Yeah, well, he's very clearly, openly invoking the Cold War era as though McCarthyism was a good idea. I think most Americans would look back at that period in our history with shame and regret. And Trump seems to think, and probably some of his voters think, that it's something that we should go back to. And it's remarkable that he thinks that this would be a winning political idea in an electoral season.
Phyllis Bennis, your response in Washington, D.C.
You know, Amy, I think this point about the link with the McCarthy period is very crucial. What he's really calling for is a return of HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, that so infamously was involved in destroying so many people's lives with false allegations of being fellow travelers or members of the Communist Party, with exactly this kind of extreme vetting that kept out immigrants, but also went after residents and citizens in this country. So this notion of establishing a new, what he called a commission on radical Islam, when I saw those words, I thought, oh my God, this is a return to HUAC, to the House Un-American Activities Committee, which famously continued until the very end, when it was finally brought down by shame, when one of the officials turned to one of the prosecutors and said, "Have you no shame, sir?" It was, you know, this moment of ending this extraordinary repressive example of what that period was. And here he is essentially equating the global war on terror, for which he really has very much the same kinds of policies that are being imposed now, with a few differences, asserting keeping Guantanamo Bay prison open instead of hoping to close it, even though it remains open. So there's not a lot of difference in the actual policies, but what Donald Trump's speech tried to do was to assert that this question of terrorism, which is something that is affecting a wide range of regions around the world, certainly, but has not come close to the question of the risks of World War II, when he talked about comparing it to the war against fascism, the war against Nazism. This is a ludicrous comparison, and yet he's talking about establishing the same kind of response, meaning this ideological test, this notion of extreme vetting. It's as if he's asserting the value of extremism as the reason people should support his candidacy, because he's an extremist.
It's interesting. The words he used are sometimes words that are leveled against him. Let's go back to just a clip of what he said.
Those who do not believe in our Constitution or who support bigotry and hatred will not be admitted for immigration into our country.
Linda Sarsour.
I mean, that was literally like a comedy show. I thought I was like Saturday Night Live. I mean, he's the first person to be deported. He's the first person I'd sign his deportation proceeding to be at the airport waving him goodbye. He's running a campaign on the very things that he's saying he's going to fight against: bigotry, hatred. He's talking about taking down fascism and comparing what he wants to do to the era of taking down fascism. He is an American fascist, and this is what his campaign has been all about. And again, the scariest part of it, again, is not Donald Trump. It's the people that come to his rallies and cheer him on in that room, and the people that think that his ideas are good ideas. And you know this, Amy, if there was a committee on radical Islam, you and I would be the first targets. This idea that anyone that criticizes the U.S. government, anyone who is considered, quote, unpatriotic, we would be the first people to be targeted. So he's creating an environment of law and order. He wants to keep everybody in line. If you don't agree with Donald Trump and his supporters, you are not welcomed here. So that's a big portion of the American people. So hopefully, I'm just hoping he's not the next president of the United States.
Well, we're going to go to break and then come back to this discussion and expand it to what he said about and the recent reports on Russia, talk about Iraq, Iran. We're talking with Linda Sarsour, Matt Taibbi, and Phyllis Bennis. Linda is director of the first Muslim online organizing platform Empower Change. Matt Taibbi, a Rolling Stone reporter. And Phyllis Bennis is with the Institute for Policy Studies. This is Democracy Now! Back in a minute. To Your Ego by Frank Black here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. On Monday, Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump invoked the Cold War as he pledged to wage war against what he described as the ideology of radical Islam. During his speech in Youngstown, Ohio, Trump also reversed his position on NATO, saying he would work closely with the alliance to defeat ISIS.
We will also work very closely with NATO on this new mission. I had previously said that NATO was obsolete because it failed to deal adequately with terrorism. Since my comments, they have changed their policy and now have a new division focused on terror threats. Very good. Very, very good. I also believe that we could find common ground with Russia in the fight against ISIS.
That's Donald Trump in Youngstown. Phyllis Bennis, why don't you take a shot at this?
Well, you know, I think that, first of all, his early critique of NATO was not about its lack of focus on terrorism. It was about the fact that, in his view, NATO countries don't pay enough money to NATO, and therefore the U.S. is carrying too much of the burden. So he's now trying to claim credit for the fact that NATO took up an anti-terrorism section after the attacks in France and Brussels. That's what the response was. It wasn't because Donald Trump made a comment. So that's one side of it. The other side, though, you know, certainly I think it's always better to be talking about diplomacy, to be talking about negotiations with all other countries, certainly including Russia, rather than basing the relationship with Russia on threats, on new sanctions, et cetera. I do think, though, that the problem here is that we did not hear any actual plan for diplomacy. There was no reference to the existing diplomacy that has supposed to be underway between the United States and Russia regarding the war in Syria. That diplomacy has been very, very limited to what can we bomb together. There has not been a serious diplomatic move. If Donald Trump had been serious about rebuilding a different kind of relationship with Russia, he would have spoken about a new kind of diplomacy based on finding diplomatic rather than military solutions when we know that these military solutions have failed. He has no acknowledgement that the military solutions that he is talking about simply escalating, that they have failed and they will continue to fail. So this notion of a new position on NATO, because I spoke about it, is simply not based on either the history of what he actually said in the past or the potential of what there's going to have to be if there's going to be an easing of the tensions between Russia and the West, whether over Ukraine, whether the stationing of new NATO forces surrounding Russia, which is what's going on right now. All of those realities have to be taken up in a diplomatic way, but he's not talking about serious diplomacy.
Speaking Monday at a campaign event in Scranton, Pennsylvania, Vice President Joe Biden, who is together with Hillary Clinton, said Donald Trump would make America less safe.
This guy's shame has no limits. He's even gone so far as to ask Putin and Russia to conduct cyber attacks against the United States of America. No. Even if he is joking, which he's not. Even if he's joking. What an outrageous thing to say. Look, folks, these are not isolated examples. He's even showered praise on Saddam Hussein, one of the vilest dictators of the 20th century, a man who repeatedly backed terror attacks against Israel because he was supposedly, the reason he admires him, he was a killer of terrorists. That's why he likes Saddam. He would have loved Stalin. He would have loved Stalin.
That was Vice President Joe Biden speaking in Scranton, Pennsylvania, together with Hillary Clinton. Now, Matt Taibbi, you're with Rolling Stone now. You lived in Moscow for 10 years. 5 of those years you were editor of a newspaper called The Exile. Talk about Russia here. Hillary Clinton's views on Russia, Donald Trump, even take it to Paul Manafort, who the New York Times has been running pieces exposing ties to the Russian-friendly former head of Ukraine.
Yeah, so a story came out yesterday in the New York Times that had a couple of scoops in it. One sort of linked Trump's campaign manager, Paul Manafort, to pro-Kremlin forces who supported the Yanukovych regime in Ukraine. There was some details about some dealings that Manafort had with a figure named Oleg Deripaska, who's sort of one of the earliest Russian oligarchs. He was a much feared figure during the 90s and throughout the 2000s. These stories are interesting. It was interesting that Trump chose to keep his remarks about working with Russia in his speech yesterday after this pseudo-bombshell report in the New York Times. I think a different campaign might have edited those remarks out so as to take the spotlight away from Russia for a day or two. But he's been right out in the open and talking about how he wants to continue working with Russia. Incidentally, the idea of now let's work with NATO and let's work with Russia at the same time, he neglects to point out that there's some contradiction there. Obviously, the Russians have a tremendous, it's a tremendous domestic issue in Russia, the expansion of NATO, and so that would somehow have to be smoothed over diplomatically in order for us all to work together collectively against ISIS. That issue would have to be dealt with before we could effectively work with Vladimir Putin.
And just to be clear, the New York Times expose yesterday that handwritten ledgers unearthed by Ukraine's newly formed National Anti-Corruption Bureau showed nearly $13 million of cash payments that were slated to go to Paul Manafort, the campaign manager for Donald Trump. Right. Not known whether he actually received them, but he spent years, from 2010 to 2014, with Yanukovych.
Oh, yeah.
Has an office in Kiev.
Yes, he's worked with all sorts of unsavory characters, from Mobutu Sese Seko to Ferdinand Marcos, and Yanukovych was another one. And yes, he's made a lot of money. He's never denied that. They did find this ledger after 2014, after Yanukovych stepped down, and but he's denied that he ever received this money. So as of now, all they have is the ledger showing that this payment was made. We don't know yet where that's going to lead.
Well, I want to turn to Hillary Clinton, who spoke alongside Biden in Scranton, Pennsylvania, just as Donald Trump was giving his major foreign policy address in Youngstown.
He talked about letting Syria become a free zone for ISIS. a major country in the Middle East that could launch attacks against us and others. He's talked about sending ground troops, American ground troops. Well, that is off the table as far as I am concerned. So we'll wait and see what he says today. But, you know, sometimes he says he won't tell anyone what he'll do because he wants to keep his plan, quote, secret. And then it turns out the secret is he has no plan.
That's Hillary Clinton. Phyllis Bennis, your response.
You know, this is a serious challenge when we're talking about the strategy for these wars. The notion that Hillary Clinton is saying that's off the table. I'd like to know if she's opposed to the thousands of U.S. troops that are now officially, openly in Iraq, the hundreds that are officially, openly in Syria. She hasn't said whether she would call them back, whether she would simply not escalate. So her own position here is very unclear. One of the things that Trump had said about Iraq, which was quite extraordinary, was this notion that as he was against nation building, he said what we should have done in Iraq was keep control of the oil, because that would have, on the one hand, kept the money from the oil out of the hands of ISIS, and on the other hand, it would mean that we would, of course, have soldiers on the ground to protect that oil. So he was calling for a permanent deployment of troops, a permanent occupation of Iraq. Hillary Clinton's position is very unclear. What would she do in Iraq? And the problem is, it's the critique that she's making is fine, but she has no answer for it herself. She has called for an escalation in Syria, for the creation of a no-fly zone in Syria. No one is asking her whether she believes that her former colleague in the Obama cabinet, the then Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, who said he was against a no-fly zone in Libya, because the first act of a no-fly zone is an act of war to take out the anti-aircraft system. Now, Libya hardly had an anti-aircraft system. Syria has a very developed, first Soviet-installed and Russian-supplied anti-aircraft system. So is Hillary Clinton saying it's okay to go to war against Russia? Is she calling for that? No one is pressing her on that question. No one asked her that question after her own speech. So her position of saying how outrageous the positions of Donald Trump is accurate in its own right, but doesn't take into account the uncertainty of her own position, whether she would support more ground troops, whether she would support a so-called no-fly zone that would immediately be extended to a regime change action, as it was in Libya. These are all uncertainties that we still have no answers to.
I want to turn to Donald Trump talking about Iran.
Iran, the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism, is now flush with $150 billion in cash released by the United States. Plus, if you remember from 2 weeks ago, another $400 million in actual cash that was obviously used for ransom. Worst of all, the nuclear deal puts Iran, the #1 state sponsor of radical Islamic terrorism, on a path to nuclear weapons.
Phyllis Bennis, your response.
Well, first of all, I mean, where to start in that? The notion that Iran is the leading state sponsor of what he calls radical Islamist terror, by which he means primarily ISIS and al-Qaeda, who are sworn enemies of Iran. They have both theological, sectarian, as well as national fights, and Iran is one of the greatest enemies of both ISIS and al-Qaeda. You could start there with what's wrong with this. The notion that the Iran deal has put Iran on a path to a nuclear weapon, not even the critics of the deal claim that. The critics of the deal said it didn't go far enough, it didn't impose enough sanctions, something like that. That was sort of the Hillary Clinton critique and the critique of others. But none of them said that this deal puts Iran on a path towards a nuclear weapon. all 16 U.S. intelligence agencies have consistently agreed, and they don't agree on a lot, but they have consistently agreed that Iran not only has not made a nuclear weapon, is not trying to make a nuclear weapon, but that it had not even reached the decision that it wanted to make a nuclear weapon. So this is simply created whole cloth.
Before we end, I wanted to get to what happened here in New York. Hundreds gathered here in New York Monday for the funeral of Imam Malama Akanji and his assistant Thara Udin, who were shot in the back of their heads while walking home from prayer in broad daylight Saturday. On Monday, a suspected shooter, Oscar Morel, was charged with 2 counts of second-degree murders. Authorities said it's not clear whether the attacks were targeted as a result of their faith. This is New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio, who spoke at Monday's funeral.
And we know there are voices all over this country who are spewing hate, trying to create division, trying to turn one American against another. I look around at all my brothers and sisters here. I see proud Americans. I see proud New Yorkers. And I will never let us be torn apart, and we will not let each other be torn apart.
That was New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio. Linda Sarsour, your final comment.
I mean, just an outrageous and traumatic experience, and we may never know the motive. The 2 victims are dead and can't speak for themselves about what happened, but it still validates why, in this climate, the Muslim community is on edge and very afraid. And we should be able to live freely and safely and walk home from our mosque without being targets of murder in our streets.
Well, we're going to leave it there, continue this discussion, of course. Linda Sarsour, thanks for being with us, head of Empower Change and co-founder of Muslim Democratic Club of New York. Rolling Stone's Matt Taibbi, we will link to your pieces, the latest, The Summer of the Shill, and Phyllis Bennis of the Institute for Policy Studies. This is Democracy Now! Back in a minute.
I won't just conform, no matter how you shake my core, 'cause my roots, they run deep. Oh, you have so little faith. Don't doubt it, don't doubt it. Victory is in my veins. I know it, and I will not negotiate. I'll fight it, I will try.
Rise by Katy Perry. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman as we go to Rio, the site of the Summer Olympic Games, for part 2 of our conversation with sports writer Jesse Washington of the site The Undefeated and Anthony Irvin, who just became the oldest ever individual Olympic swimming gold medalist. I began by asking Jesse Washington about Jamaican sprinter Usain Bolt, who made history by becoming the first Olympian to win the 100-meter gold medal 3 times in a row.
It's obvious that Usain Bolt is incredible and that nobody can stay in front of this guy. And his story in and of itself is well documented, his greatness. Someone asked him, you're already a legend, what comes after legend? And he said, I like the sound of the word immortal. And what he's done is pretty crazy. But I'm really intrigued by Justin Gatlin. So doping has been a big issue here at these games, due to a lot of factors, the IOC.
Now explain who Justin Gatlin is, who came in second to Usain Bolt.
Yes. Justin Gatlin is the 2nd fastest man on the planet, and you would think that people would be interested in seeing him run. However, when he entered the stadium and his name was announced, a cascade of boos rained down on him in Olympic Stadium. And I'm not sure where that goes with the Olympic ideal and the Olympic charter, but it was an extraordinary moment. Nobody could remember such an accomplished athlete getting booed at the beginning of a gold medal sprint. So it must have been unbelievably hard for Justin Gatlin, who already had only a tiny chance to beat Usain Bolt, to run with that type of feeling. I can't imagine how that would be. Tony, as a competitor, if you got booed before a race, would it make it harder for you to win?
I think it would be impossible to do well at all.
Really? It really affects you that much?
I don't have the strength to take that on.
So, Jesse Washington, explain why the sprinter Justin Gatlin was booed on Sunday night.
Justin Gatlin 10 years ago tested positive for testosterone, and he was banned from the sport for 4 years. So apparently, on the one hand, yes, he was guilty. On the second hand, should he be castigated for life? Should he wear a scarlet D on his forehead for the rest of his career? These are questions that we have to wrestle with as sports fans, as human beings. I find the whole case similar to the way in the United States, if you are convicted of a felony, in some places, you cannot vote for the rest of your life. I myself, as somebody who has stumbled and fallen in my career, in my life, who's made mistakes, if I'm constantly kept from overcoming those, what kind of people are we? Do we offer a chance for redemption for anybody? Or as an athlete, if you cheat, if you make a mistake and do what the vast majority of your sport is doing, are we going to kick you to the curb for life? These are some of the things that I saw going on. I think the moment overwhelmed Justin Gatlin. He ran slower in this Olympic final than he ran 6 weeks ago at the Olympic trials. He had a small chance to beat Bolt, but I think when those boos came down on him, that just ended any chance of a miracle finish. It was really remarkable to see.
Tony, Irvin, Jesse just asked you how the crowd affects you and if you can even hear them in the midst of all of this. And I'm wondering about that, the community around when you are doing your race. But also, Usain Bolt saying, you know, thinking of the word immortal. You take a very different approach.
Well, to talk first about the audience, I mean, I know who my people were out there, who they were out there in the crowd. I didn't need to specifically hear them to know they were there and cheering. But, you know, I had a Brazilian in my heat. And, you know, Bruno Fratos, and, you know, he was ranked #1 in the world, like, all year. And they were going for him. And I was feeling that energy, because it's positive energy no matter what. You know, the audience, they want to see a great race. So that certainly motivates you, whether it's coming for you or necessarily for someone that you're with. But if you're with them in that field, then that's for you too. You know, on the flip side, you know, whenever a Russian came out to compete, they got booed. And, you know, I felt for them because, you know, I know a few Russians. I've trained with them. And they're good people. Like, I don't know. I want to give them the benefit of the doubt that they weren't consciously doping, that if their sport governing body was doing something, it was behind their knowledge. And, you know, so to have them, you know, they struggle to even get to the Olympics, to get the approval to race, and then to have to walk out and get booed, that's hard. You know, I definitely had compassion for them in that. And, you know, I haven't even had the opportunity to talk to them yet on how they felt about it.
In fact, Jesse Washington, that issue of what, a third of the Russian team that came to Rio was disqualified, and they learned it while they were in Rio, right?
I'm having a hard time even keeping track of the Russians that are in, the Russians that are out. There was a woman who was cleared to compete, I think, in the long jump from Russia, and the track competition had already started. I can't imagine what it would be like to be an athlete and show up, travel across the world to a race or an event you might not even get to be in. So it seems like this should have been settled a long time ago. I'm not all up on the ins and outs of doping and the legalities and the arguments and things like that. I think that this is a world where people deserve second chances, whether that comes in this Olympics or the next one. I don't believe in banning an athlete for life, forever, for a mistake that they or their coach or their government may have made. So it's sort of a mess here in Rio around all this doping stuff.
I want to go to Olympic gold medalist for judo, Rafaela Silva.
I want to show those who criticized me in London, who said I was an embarrassment to my family, that a monkey belongs in a cage and not in the Olympics, that now the monkey who was supposed to be in a cage in London is out of the cage and is an Olympic champion.
Jesse, can you talk about the significance of Rafaela Silva's win?
Yes. Race in Brazil is very interesting, and it's not the same dynamic that we have in the States. Earlier, Tony mentioned the one-drop rule. If anywhere in your ancestry, going back to West Africa, there is a black person, and in the United States, you're black. Here in Brazil, it's much different. Brazil has a very complicated situation that is more based on class than race. Couple of pieces of context. Brazil was the last place in this hemisphere to outlaw slavery. And once they did outlaw slavery, half of the population was black, so they said, we need to bring in a lot of Europeans right now to literally lighten up the country. So Fast forward to today. Brazil likes to say race doesn't matter, we're all Brazilians. They never had Jim Crow. They never had segregation. They never had places where you could not go because you're black. However, of the poor people here, if you live in a poor area called a favela, there's white people there, there's black people, there's brown people in the middle. All of them are basically the N-words of Brazil because they are poor. So that's the basic dynamic. One more thing to layer on top of that, which gets to our judo champion here. There is a privilege associated in Brazil with lighter skin. People want to marry people who are lighter than them so their children will have more opportunities. If there is a toilet to be cleaned or a floor to be scrubbed, it is more likely that a darker skinned person is doing it here in Brazil. There are very few dark-skinned people at the upper echelons of business and government. So all of these dynamics came out with this tremendous athlete, and she's being targeted just for the color of her skin, even in a country like Brazil, which supposedly has no race. So to me, that ultimately says you can try to deny it, you can try to say we're all colorblind, let's not look at that, which is something that is, some people say in the United States as well. But at the end of the day, let's really reckon with the privilege that goes along with having white skin, and once we can talk about it, then maybe we can eliminate it.
Let me go back to Rafaela Silva, again, the Olympic gold medalist, the judoka.
Since the first time I stepped out onto the tatame, I was used to jumping into other people's houses to get my kite. The ball, people taking my flip-flops was a reason to get into a fight. So I think my trainer wanted to channel all this aggression I had into some kind of sport. And in judo, we need this type of will. Growing up in the community in the favela, we have to have that determination. We have to win everything by merit. We don't get anything for free.
Again, that's Olympic gold medalist for judo, Rafaela Silva. Jesse, if you could talk about going into the favelas yourself. I mean, you're not, you and Tony Irvin are not just anywhere in the world and it's just the Olympics. You are in a place, you are in Brazil, and there have been mass protests against the Olympics. Of course, the president, Dilma Rousseff was thrown out of office, and now she's going to go through an impeachment process. Many are calling it a coup. Why did you decide to go into the favelas, and what did people say there?
I thought it was important to get out of the Olympic bubble, and it's easy to just look around at these multi-million-dollar venues and these nice air-conditioned buses that they have for us to ride around in and forget about the rest of the country. And so I was fortunate enough to have some folks who knew some folks in the largest favela in Brazil, the favela of Rocinha. And the people that I met there had a pride and a sense of community and really a love for their favela that's similar to what you see in the United States in poor communities. Hey, we may be poor here, but we're making a good life for ourselves. We love each other. We take care of each other, and we are going to survive. No matter what happens, we're here and we're going to make it. A lot of the people there said, well, violence with the drug dealers makes it tough. And there's a lot of gun shootouts and raids with the police and the drug dealers, and that causes a lot of violence and a lot of deaths. There was a security officer who made a wrong turn into a favela during the Olympics and was killed. But at the same time, they do say that there is a stereotype about favelas. And when I was there, there's all these warnings, oh, you don't want to walk in there, you won't come out with, you know, your wallet or your phone. But it was a normal community full of normal people doing normal things. They have stores, they shop. And another interesting thing that they did was they bodyboard. And I was able to meet a whole school of young people that is taught how to do this sport, which is a pro sport. And they have a beautiful beach at the bottom of the largest favela in Brazil. So this juxtaposition of the perception and the reality, it's something that I keep coming back to in our discussions today. A lot of times the media likes to create a narrative without really probing beneath the surface. I think it's important to probe beneath the surface everywhere, including the favelas of Brazil.
Let me go back to the firsts. Jesse Washington, what do you know about the refugee team?
Great story of people from war-torn nations who would never have made it to the Olympics but for the IOC doing something right for change and allowing them to compete under a unified banner. I had a chance to talk briefly with one or two of them, and they are not competitive in their events. but that's not the point. So it's a victory for them even to compete. I was moved just by their perseverance and their determination to get here. There's millions of refugees all over the world. I hope we can give some of the attention and the light to those who are not athletes as well.
And just to explain what it is, what the IOC had to do with this, the International Olympic Committee?
They did march in the opening ceremonies together as a team from different nations under the banner of refugees. And I kind of like it because it flips what is pejorative. And in the United States, we're saying that we should keep refugees out from places where a bomb could hit your house in the middle of the night while you're sleeping and your children are sleeping, but we're not going to allow them into the United States. The IOC is allowing them to Olympics, so let's pay some attention to that.
And Tony Irvin, you are not afraid to speak out politically or in any way. Maybe it's the wisdom of your years, but not a lot of Olympians feel the same way. Can you talk about this and also your reverence for or the fact that you studied Muhammad Ali?
Oh, I'm definitely afraid to speak out. Like, I do so fearfully of the repercussion that comes at me because of it. So, yeah, don't think that I'm not afraid when I do it.
What are the repercussions?
And yeah, well, just a mob comes at you of people you don't even know. Like, that's the fear. That people come for you for something they don't understand. Not as you do, at least. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think Muhammad Ali is, he's the patron saint of the Olympics. So I was reading about him in the civil rights era, the day of my race. I was trying to keep calm and find some peace, and I was sitting there reading about it, and it's I don't want to get too much into it because his struggles are well documented and his life is well documented, and anybody can go and read it. But that image of him in Atlanta in '96 with the Olympic torch and lighting that flame, may that flame never go out.
And Tony, is Tokyo next for you?
Yeah, I definitely want to be there. Tokyo is one of my favorite cities in the world. Whether I'm competing there in a suit, cap and goggles, or wearing a suit and tie in some other role, I definitely want to be there.
What does it mean to you to be the oldest gold medalist in swimming?
It means that swimmers generally give up the sport and retire kind of early for a variety of reasons. Probably financial, the pay isn't that lucrative unless you're, Michael Phelps. But, pro athletes keep going into their 30s in all sports. You see it in all the American sports, baseball, basketball, football. They can keep going, and while the body may resist at times and recovery is a little bit harder, I'm so much wiser with my choices. So the preservation of what I do becomes easier to handle. So, the cliche, the age is just a number. It's the desire to do it or not. I'm still relevant as a competitor for now. But swimming is one of those things that once you do it, you can keep doing it forever. So even if I'm not relevant in a competitive sense, I'm still going to be swimming.
And finally, Jesse, The Undefeated ran a column by Michael Jordan, who spoke out for the first time publicly about being a black man in response to the issue of police brutality and Black Lives Matter. Can you talk about the significance of this?
It was a pretty deep significance because Jordan is probably the most famous athlete on the planet, and he had always shied away from speaking out in favor of black issues, black problems. There is a quote that is attributed to him, probably incorrectly, that says when he was asked to support a black Senate candidate who was running against a rather borderline racist white guy in North Carolina who shall remain unnamed, Jesse Helms. And Jordan is alleged to have said, "Republicans buy sneakers too." And this quote has followed him throughout his career. So while we admire Michael for his athletic accomplishments, and he's the GOAT, the greatest of all time when it comes to basketball, he was not the blackest of all time when it came to social issues. So Fast forward to 2016, The Undefeated is a website about race and sports and the juxtapositions and intersections of those issues. And our editor-in-chief, Kevin Merida, happened to be in a conversation with one of Jordan's representatives, and he said, how's Michael feeling about all this stuff that's going on in the news? And this was right after Philando Castile and Alton Sterling had been killed, and it was after the police officers in Dallas and Baton Rouge had been killed, and our nation was really convulsed in this moment, and Jordan felt that it was time to say something. And our editor-in-chief, Kevin, being the newsman that he is, made that happen and was able to work with Jordan to bring his statement to the world, which I thought was pretty positive because it acknowledged the need for understanding on both sides. And Jordan decided to donate $1 million to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and to an organization for police officers to increase ties with the community. So it was a major moment in athletes and social activism. This younger generation of athletes, LeBron, Kobe, Kyrie, they're more comfortable with the activism. They have more of a voice. Their brands are more powerful. They sell sneakers regardless. Jordan, in a sense, had to catch up with them. They may need to catch up with his basketball legacy, but with that one statement on The Undefeated, Jordan made up some of the ground in the social legacy that these young ballers have established.
And Tony Irvin, what this meant for you as an African-American athlete. Michael Jordan saying, as a proud American and a black man, I've been deeply troubled by the deaths of African-Americans at the hands of law enforcement, angered by the cowardly and hateful targeting of the killing of police officers.
I mean, well, he's right. For one, it's horrible. The plight of being, I mean, just the morale of being black in America is got to be terrifying if you see those lights coming at you, because you don't know what's going to happen. You want someone who's just trying to do their job and is a good person, but what they don't want is just someone who's going to come take your life.
Have you ever experienced anything?
I don't even know how we're going to move past it.
Have you ever experienced anything like that?
No, I haven't. I've passed out of being able to have to deal with that.
And Jesse, you?
I've been stopped by the police a few times in areas gray and not so gray. I was no saint when I was a young man, and I've had to deal with it a little bit. The interesting thing is that both Tony and myself both have moms who are white Jewish women from New York City, but just by the genetic dice roll of the universe, I look like I do, and Tony looks like he does. And you can have different experiences, different expectations, different burdens placed upon you or removed from you. So it's a very interesting dynamic that it's still a big deal. You know, I tweeted this week that I was the only black journalist in the press conference for the only black woman to win a individual gold medal in swimming at the Olympics. And the response to that was overwhelming. And many people said, what are you talking about? Why are you pointing this out? What does this mean? What does this matter? So there's still a deep resistance to dealing with the kind of issues that Tony has had to face since he got in the pool and won medals in 2000, and that we cover at The Undefeated, and that I dealt with as a young man. So hopefully we can start to wrestle with some of these things even when the president of the United States is not a black man. If I could say it real quick about Obama, a lot of people don't even want to say that he's the first black president. Oh, he's the first biracial president. You know, Obama and myself both have white moms. What people fail to understand is that you don't get to decide if you're black or not. Society looks at you and decides if you're black. And so Obama gonna stay black, you know, until the end. So if you want to take that away from him, that's think about what you're trying to do to rob somebody of the identity that not only have they chosen for themselves, but that America put on them. So we got a long way to go to wrestle with some of these things, and it's going to take, it might take 3 or 4 more black presidents, a Buddhist and a Muslim president, woman in an hijab to solve this problem.
Sports writer Jesse Washington of The Undefeated, and Anthony Irvin, who just became the oldest ever individual Olympic swimming gold medalist at the age of 35. And that does it for our show. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.